All this seemed to suit him fine. To my astonishment, our local pet store carried a product called vitaminized hermit crab cakes. Tempting enough, till you read the ingredients, but we passed, since our household leans more toward the recycling ethic. We give him leftovers. Buster's rapture is the day I drag the unidentifiable things in cottage cheese containers out of the back of the fridge. We've also learned to give him a continually changing assortment of seashells, which he tries on and casts off like Cinderella's stepsisters preening for the ball. He'll sometimes try to squeeze into ludicrous outfits too small to contain him. Who can't relate? In other moods, he will disappear into a conch the size of my 2 fists and sit for a day, immobilized by the weight of upward mobility. He is in every way the perfect housemate. Quiet, entertaining, and willing to eat up the trash. He went to school for first-grade show and tell, and was such a hit the principal called up to congratulate me, I think, for being a broad-minded mother. It was a long time, though, before we began to understand the content of Buster's character. He required more patient observation than we were in the habit of giving to a small, cold-blooded life. As months went by, we would periodically notice with great disappointment that Buster seemed to be dead. Or not entirely dead, but ill, or maybe suffering the crab equivalent of the blues. He would burrow into a gravelly corner, shrink deep into his shell, and not move for days and days. We'd take him out to play, dunk him in water, offer him a new frock. Nothing. He wanted to be still. Life being what it is, we'd eventually quit prodding our sick friend to cheer up and would move on to the next stage of a difficult friendship, neglect. We'd ignore him wholesale, only to realize at some point later on that he'd lapsed into hyperactivity. We'd find him ceaselessly patrolling the 4 corners of his world, turning over rocks, rooting out and dragging around truly disgusting pork chop bones, digging up his cactus and replanting it on its head. At night, when the household fell silent, I would lie in bed listening to his methodical, pebbly racket from the opposite end of the house. Buster was manic-depressive. I wondered if he might be responding to the moon. I'm partial to lunar cycles, ever since I learned as a teenager that human females in their natural state, which is to say, sleeping outdoors, arrive at menses in synchrony and ovulate with the full moon. My imagination remains captive to that primordial village, the comradely grumpiness of new moon days when the entire world at once would go on PMS alert, and the compensation that would turn up 2 weeks later on a wild wind under that great round headlamp, driving both men and women to distraction with the overt prospect of conception. The surface of the land literally rises and falls as much as 50 centimeters as the moon passes over, and we clay-footed mortals fall like dominoes before the swell. It's no surprise at all if a full moon inspires lyricists to corny love songs, or inmates to slamming themselves against barred windows. A hermit crab hardly seems this impetuous, but animals are notoriously responsive to the full moon. Wolves howl. Roosters announce daybreak all night. Luna moths, Arctic loons, and lunatics have a soul inspiration in common. Buster's insomniac restlessness seemed likely to be a part of the worldwide full moon fellowship. But it wasn't exactly. The full moon didn't shine on either end of his cycle, the high or the low. We tried to keep track, but it soon became clear. Buster marched to his own drum. The cyclic force that moved him remained as mysterious to us as his true gender and the workings of his crustacean soul. Buster's aquarium occupies a spot on our kitchen counter right next to the coffee pot, and so it became my habit to begin mornings with chin in hands, pondering the oceanic mysteries while awaiting percolation. Finally, I remembered something. Years ago, when I was a graduate student of animal behavior, I passed my days reading about the likes of animals' internal clocks, temperature, photoperiod, the rise and fall of hormones, all these influences have been teased apart like so many threads from the rope that pulls every creature to its regulated destiny. But one story takes the cake. F.A. Brown, a researcher who is more or less the grandfather of the biological clock, set about in 1954 to track the cycles of intertidal oysters. He scooped his subjects from the clammy coast of Connecticut and moved them into the basement of a laboratory in landlocked Illinois. For the first 15 days in their new aquaria, the oysters kept right up with their normal intertidal behavior. They spent time shut away in their shells, and time with their mouths wide open, siphoning their briny bath for the plankton that sustained them as the tides ebbed and flowed on the distant Connecticut shore. In the next 2 weeks, they made a mystifying shift. They still carried out their cycles in unison and were regular as the tides, but their high tide behavior didn't coincide with high tide in Connecticut, or for that matter California, or any other tidal charts known to science. It dawned on the researchers after some calculations that the oysters were responding to high tide in Chicago. Never mind that the gentle mollusks lived in glass boxes in the basement of a steel and cement building, nor that Chicago has no ocean. In the circumstances, the oysters were doing their best. When Buster is running around for all he's worth, I can only presume it's high tide in Tucson. With or without evidence, I'm romantic enough to believe it. This is the lesson of Buster, the poetry that camps outside the halls of science. Jump for joy, hallelujah, even a desert has tides. When I was 22, I donned the shell of a tiny yellow Renault and drove with all I owned from Kentucky to Tucson. I was a typical young American striking out. I had no earthly notion that I was bringing on myself a calamity of the magnitude of the one that befell poor Buster. I am the commonest kind of North American refugee. I believe I like it here, far flung from my original home. I've come to love the desert that bristles and breathes and sleeps outside my windows. In the course of 17 years, I've embedded myself in a family here. Neighbors, colleagues, friends I can't foresee living without, and a child who is native to this ground with loves of her own. I'm here for good, it seems. And yet I never cease to long in my bones for what I left behind. I open my eyes on every new day expecting that a creek will run through my backyard under broad-leafed maples, and that my mother will be whistling in the kitchen. Behind the howl of coyotes, I'm listening for meadowlarks. I sometimes ache to be rocked in the bosom of the blood relations and the busybodies of my childhood. Particularly in my years as a mother without a mate, I have deeply missed the safety net of extended family. In a city of 500,000, I still really look at every face, anticipating recognition, because I grew up in a town where every face meant something to me. I have trouble remembering to lock the doors. Wariness of strangers I learned the hard way. When I was new to the city, I let a man into my house one hot afternoon because he seemed in dire need of a drink of water. When I turned from the kitchen sink, I found sharpened steel shoved against my belly, and so I know. But I cultivate suspicion with as much difficulty as I force tomatoes to grow in the drought-stricken hardpan of my strange backyard. No creek runs here, but I'm still listening to secret tides, living as if I belonged to an earlier place, not Kentucky necessarily, but a welcoming earth and a human family, a forest, a species. In my life, I've had frightening losses and unfathomable gifts. A knife in my stomach, the death of an unborn child, sunrise in a rainforest, a stupendous column of blue butterflies rising from a Greek monastery, a car that spontaneously caught fire while I was driving it, the loss of my first marriage, followed by a year in which I could barely understand how to keep living, the discovery, just weeks ago when I rose from my desk and walked into the kitchen, of 3 strangers industriously relieving my house of its contents.